At 0941, the boardroom cameras showed polite smiles, polished watches, and one fatal mistake no one noticed yet. By Friday, the company's client migration had collapsed like wet paper in the rain, and the same executives who erased her name from the system were whispering it in panic behind closed glass doors. The rain had started before sunrise, turning the windows of the 32nd floor into long, trembling mirrors. Inside the conference room, the city looked distant and unreal, drowned behind silver clouds and cold blue reflections. Coffee machines hissed somewhere down the corridor. Slack notifications blinked endlessly across muted laptop screens. Nobody laughed that morning, although everyone pretended to smile with the polished exhaustion unique to corporate leadership. At exactly 0941, the COO adjusted his cufflinks and leaned toward the microphone as if he were about to announce quarterly growth instead of dismantling someone's career. "The company needs to move faster without you." The sentence landed softly, too softly, like a knife wrapped in velvet. Several cameras on the board call flickered. One director lowered his eyes immediately. Another pretended to read documents he had already memorized. The CEO stayed very still, fingers folded beneath his chin, avoiding the screen where Elena's face remained perfectly calm. That calm unsettled them more than anger would have, because Elena Navarro had built the architecture beneath nearly everything they touched. Not the glossy presentations shown to investors, not the bright dashboards marketing loved posting online, the real system. The invisible veins carrying millions of transactions every hour without collapsing under pressure. And everyone in that room knew it. The COO continued speaking in rehearsed corporate phrases about organizational agility and new leadership alignment. The kind of language polished by consultants who charged hourly rates large enough to buy houses. Words that smelled sterile, expensive, and hollow at the same time. Outside the glass walls, assistants moved quickly through corridors carrying tablets and stress-like trays of boiling water. Nobody stopped walking, but several employees slowed just enough to glance toward the conference room. News traveled fast in offices. Fear traveled faster. Elena listened without interrupting. That frightened them too. 3 months earlier, she had warned them the client migration timeline was impossible. The infrastructure wasn't stable enough for accelerated transfer volumes. Certain regional clusters still relied on legacy dependencies buried deep inside the payment routing layer, hidden fractures beneath fresh paint. But speed impressed investors. Careful engineers did not. The CEO had sided with the COO publicly during the strategy summit. Elena still remembered the applause afterward. Bright stage lights, sharp tailored suits, empty confidence floating through the ballroom like perfume. "Complexity is the enemy of growth," the COO had declared. The audience loved it. Elena almost laughed now remembering the line. Complexity wasn't their enemy. Ignorance was. A notification appeared quietly on her second monitor. "Legal counsel, please forward original infrastructure documentation before end of day." Interesting timing. Across the board call, someone cleared their throat nervously. The COO finished his speech with the polished sympathy of a man protecting his bonus package. "We appreciate your contributions over the years." Contributions. As if she had organized birthday cakes instead of building the operational spine of a billion-dollar platform. Elena closed her notebook slowly. The soft click echoed louder in her mind than the entire meeting. "Understood," she said. "Nothing more. No dramatic exit. No accusations. No shattered professionalism." That silence created a strange discomfort in the room. Executives understood conflict. They understood pleading, anger, emotional negotiations. Silence was harder. Silence forced people to hear themselves. And somewhere beneath their confidence, they already sensed something unstable shifting under the floorboards. The meeting ended. Screens vanished one by one. The CEO disconnected first. "Coward," Elena thought calmly. She stood near the window for several seconds after the call, watching tiny headlights crawl through rain-soaked streets below. The office behind her hummed with artificial air and muted tension. A junior analyst passed by carrying folders, pretending not to stare. Near the elevator lobby, two managers whispered beside the espresso machine. She took it too well. That's what scares me. Elena almost smiled. Back at her desk, she opened an encrypted archive buried beneath 6 years of layered documentation. System dependencies, routing logic, emergency rollback protocols, vendor access histories, the original infrastructure map. The document nobody outside her division fully understood. The document executives kept insisting was overly technical. Thunder rolled faintly outside while she attached the files to legal counsel's request. Her fingers moved with precise calmness, though exhaustion sat heavily behind her eyes. Not sadness. Not yet. Something colder. Disappointment had a temperature. Before pressing send, she paused briefly over one attachment labeled Migration Risk Escalation, Ignored Recommendations. A timestamp from 7 months ago glowed at the bottom. Approved by the COO himself. Interesting. She sent the email. Within 60 seconds, legal opened the files. Within 3 minutes, someone from compliance attempted to recall an older internal report. Too late. The office light suddenly felt brighter than usual, exposing every artificial smile, every carefully managed alliance, every nervous ambition wrapped inside expensive fabric. Corporate buildings always looked strongest right before panic spread through them, like luxury ships moments before passengers smelled smoke. Her access badge deactivated at 10:14, faster than expected. The elevator ride down felt strangely peaceful. Soft instrumental music played overhead, while strangers checked phones beside her, unaware that an entire executive structure upstairs had just planted the first crack in its own foundation. In the lobby, security avoided eye contact while collecting her temporary credentials. One of them quietly whispered, "I heard you built half the system." Elena adjusted her coat. Only the parts they forgot existed. Outside, cold rain kissed the pavement in silver waves. The city smelled like wet concrete and electricity. Across the street, massive digital billboards flashed advertisements about innovation, disruption, acceleration, beautiful words corporations loved until reality demanded competence instead of slogans. Her phone vibrated once, a message from an old colleague now working at a competitor. "Heard what happened, call me." Elena stared at the screen while taxis hissed through puddles nearby. Above her, somewhere behind mirrored glass and executive confidence, people were already trying to explain away the risk they barely understood. And deep inside the company servers, invisible processes continued running on logic she alone had designed to survive storms no executive presentation had ever mentioned. The dangerous part? Nobody upstairs realized how much of the system still depended on decisions they had mocked only weeks earlier. By the following Monday, someone inside the company would finally notice, but by then, the first wave would already be impossible to stop. If they had opened her warnings earlier, everything might have unfolded differently, but some companies only recognize the foundation after they hear the walls beginning to crack. Monday arrived wearing the cold metallic smell of recycled air, burnt espresso, and concealed panic. The headquarters looked identical from the outside, polished stone entrance, glowing logo, executives stepping out of black cars with the practiced confidence of people who believed expensive watches could slow consequences. But inside the building, tension moved invisibly through every corridor like smoke trapped behind walls. At 07:12, the first migration alerts appeared. Nobody escalated them immediately. That was the first mistake. In the operations center, giant monitoring screens painted the dark room in shifting blues and reds, while engineers muttered half-awake diagnostics between hurried sips of coffee. Notification sounds overlapped endlessly. One warning became 4, 4 became 17. A junior infrastructure analyst frowned at his terminal. Why are the European clusters rerouting traffic through the old authentication layer? No one answered him at first, because nobody in the room actually knew. The architecture diagrams distributed by management after Elena's departure looked clean, simplified, investor-friendly, bright arrows, elegant flowcharts, minimal dependencies, beautiful lies. The real system behaved differently under pressure. At 0803, transaction latency doubled. At 0811, clients in 3 regions lost dashboard access. At 8:26, somebody finally called the CTO. He arrived irritated rather than alarmed, carrying the kind of arrogance that survives only inside executive offices insulated from technical reality. His suit looked flawless. His understanding of the infrastructure did not. Why wasn't failover triggered automatically? Silence. An engineer hesitated before answering carefully. Because the fallback permissions were tied to the original infrastructure map. The room became very still. Everyone suddenly understood the same thing at once. The original infrastructure map was not documentation. It was survival instructions, and the person who truly understood it was already gone. Outside the operations center, rumors spread faster than official updates. Employees gathered near kitchen counters pretending to discuss ordinary work while secretly refreshing internal dashboards on their phones. Slack channels multiplied with quiet panic disguised as professionalism. Any update on client migration? Who approved the Phase 3 cutover? Why is legal in the executive war room? No one wrote Elena's name publicly, not yet. By 0940, the board scheduled an emergency call. Ironically, almost exactly 24 hours after removing the woman who had warned them this could happen. Rain hammered softly against the tower windows while executives assembled inside the glass conference room. The atmosphere no longer resembled confidence. It resembled turbulence before a crash landing. Assistants walked faster. Voices dropped lower. Even the lighting seemed colder somehow. The COO entered, speaking loudly into his phone. "We are containing the issue?" Containment. Corporate language always became poetic during disasters. The CEO stood near the window, staring down at the city with the hollow expression of a man mentally calculating how quickly investors could turn hostile. His reflection trembled faintly across the glass. "What exactly failed?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, the senior infrastructure manager cleared his throat. The migration logic depended on undocumented adaptive routing conditions. The COO frowned impatiently. In English. Another silence. Then came the sentence nobody wanted to say aloud. The system was built around Elena's architecture. There it was, the invisible ghost finally entering the room. For months, they had reduced her work to overcomplication. Now, highly paid executives sat trapped inside consequences they couldn't even fully describe. Somewhere beneath the building's polished floors and branded optimism, millions of automated decisions continued unfolding according to rules she had written years ago during outages no one else remembered. The irony tasted almost elegant. At 10:17, the first major client suspended transfers. At 10:42, a second demanded contractual review. At 11:05, internal revenue forecasts dropped 12%, then 19%, then worse. The operations center no longer sounded like an office. It sounded like a hospital during emergency intake. Chairs rolled rapidly across floors. Keyboards clattered nonstop. Screens flashed warnings faster than teams could process them. Someone cursed softly near the networking console before remembering HR was nearby, and threaded through all of it was one growing realization. They had removed the only person who understood how the foundation behaved under stress. The COO tried controlling the narrative. "She left incomplete documentation?" Legal immediately corrected him. "No, she submitted full infrastructure records yesterday morning." The room chilled several degrees, because now there was evidence, time-stamped evidence, warnings, escalation reports, deferred approvals, risk acknowledgements, signed, archived, recoverable. The CEO slowly sat down. For the first time in years, he looked less like an executive and more like an exhausted man trapped inside a collapsing performance. His tie hung slightly loose now. Tiny details like that became visible when power started leaking out of people. "What are investors seeing?" he asked quietly. No one wanted to answer. Finally, investor relations spoke. "They know about the client migration disruption. Social chatter is accelerating." Outside, financial reporters had already begun connecting fragments together: a delayed migration, executive restructuring, service instability, clients pausing contracts. Modern corporations didn't collapse dramatically anymore. They eroded publicly in real time. At 12:31, the lead investor requested a private session with the board. The message spread through leadership like ice water. By then, another internal report estimated revenue exposure at 37% if migration instability continued through the week. 37%. The number moved silently across phones and laptops throughout the company. Employees read it, pretending not to react, though everyone immediately understood what percentages like that meant: layoffs, audits, blame, and somewhere inside all that fear was another uncomfortable truth no executive presentation could erase. Elena had predicted this exact scenario. Near sunset, while storm clouds turned the skyline dark violet, the COO stood alone beside the operations center glass wall, watching exhausted engineers struggle against systems they barely understood. Reflections from monitoring screens flickered across his face like warning lights. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression. Tiny, brief, but real. One exhausted analyst finally whispered what everyone else was already thinking. "They fired the foundation of the system?" Nobody disagreed, and upstairs, behind sealed conference room doors, the lead investor had just begun asking a question the CEO was no longer prepared to survive. The answer would change everything inside the company before the week ended. If you've ever watched a company destroy its own foundation while calling it strategy, leave a comment below. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones holding everything together. The storm broke fully on Thursday morning, not outside, inside the company. By 6:50, every executive parking space beneath headquarters was occupied. Black sedans lined the underground garage like chess pieces before a final move. Security guards spoke in unusually quiet voices. Elevator screens reflected tired faces, illuminated by unread overnight emails. The building smelled different now, less like polished success, more like overheated servers and fear. In the executive war room, nobody touched the catered breakfast arranged neatly across the side table. Croissants hardened untouched beneath fluorescent lights, while financial dashboards projected catastrophic numbers onto the wall in cold white text. Client retention risk, high migration failure exposure, escalating projected revenue. Loss 37%. The number sat there mercilessly, impossible to soften with presentation language. 37%. Enough to turn confidence into investigations. The CEO rubbed both hands slowly across his face. He looked older than he had 1 week earlier. Corporate collapse aged people strangely fast, as if stress pulled years forward overnight. "What's our containment timeline?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Again, that silence had become the company's new soundtrack. Finally, the interim infrastructure director spoke carefully. "We still don't fully understand the adaptive routing behavior during regional load balancing." The COO exhaled sharply. "Then simplify it." A dangerous sentence. One engineer near the back actually laughed under his breath before realizing everyone had heard him. "Sir," he said carefully, "that's exactly what caused this." The room froze. Outside the glass walls, assistants pretended not to stare while carrying tablets between conference rooms. Slack notifications exploded across departments. Recruiters suddenly became very active on LinkedIn. Employees updated resumes quietly during lunch breaks while pretending to review spreadsheets. Nobody trusted stability anymore, and instability spread faster than outages. At 0814, the second largest enterprise client officially paused migration expansion. At 0826, internal forecasting models revised projected losses higher. At 0841, the lead investor arrived in person. That changed the atmosphere instantly. Executives who once interrupted each other now spoke cautiously. Chairs straightened, voices lowered, even the COO's confidence tightened around the edges. Victor Hale entered without greeting anyone. Tall, silver-haired, calm in the terrifying way only wealthy investors could be calm during disasters. He carried no laptop, no assistant, no visible panic. Just a slim leather folder and the expression of a man already deciding who would survive the week. Rain streaked down the conference room windows behind him, turning the skyline into blurred silver scars. "Let's skip the performance," Victor said quietly. "How exposed are we?" No one attempted corporate optimism this time. The CFO answered first. "If migration instability continues through quarter close, exposure exceeds initial projections." Victor looked directly at the CEO. "In numbers." A pause. "Potentially 37%? The investor nodded once, not surprised. That frightened everyone more than shouting would have. He opened the leather folder slowly. Inside were printed copies of escalation reports, internal approvals, and infrastructure warnings stamped with dates from months earlier. Elena's reports. The room temperature seemed to drop. "I reviewed legal archives personally this morning," Victor said. "Interesting reading." Nobody moved. The COO finally attempted defense. "We were trying to accelerate scalability objectives?" Victor turned toward him with almost surgical calmness. "You ignored the architect of the system." No anger, no raised voice, just precision, and somehow that felt worse. Downstairs, employees gathered in tiny, nervous clusters near coffee stations, pretending conversations were casual while secretly tracking executive movement. Every time legal entered another conference room, whispers spread through the floor like static electricity. "Investors here? They're auditing approvals." Someone from compliance requested deleted Slack logs. The building itself felt tense now. Elevators opened onto silence. Hallways emptied faster than usual. Even keyboards sounded cautious. Meanwhile, 50 blocks away across the city, Elena sat beside enormous windows inside the headquarters of her new company. Different tower, different badge, different future. Warm afternoon light spilled across minimalist desks, while quiet jazz drifted from hidden speakers overhead. Engineers debated architecture decisions respectfully around glass whiteboards filled with equations and deployment diagrams. Nobody interrupted each other to sound important. Nobody simplified risk for applause. The contrast almost felt unreal. Her new manager placed coffee beside her workstation. "We're impressed with your migration resilience proposal," he said. Elena smiled faintly. "Resilience matters most when leadership gets impatient." He laughed lightly, not fully understanding the sentence. Her inbox vibrated. A former coworker. "You should see what's happening here." Another message followed seconds later. "The lead investor is demanding answers about the infrastructure map." Elena stared quietly at the screen. No satisfaction touched her expression, only exhaustion. Because contrary to executive mythology, competent people rarely enjoy watching disasters they tried to prevent. There was no cinematic revenge in any of this, no triumphant music, just consequences unfolding exactly where warnings had been ignored. And consequences were rarely dramatic at first, mostly administrative, audits, reviews, archived emails suddenly becoming very important. Back at the old company, the board meeting deteriorated rapidly after noon. Legal confirmed Elena had submitted complete documentation before termination. Compliance confirmed multiple risk escalations had been acknowledged internally. Worse still, timestamp records showed the COO personally approved accelerated migration despite unresolved infrastructure concerns. The silence after that revelation stretched painfully long. The CEO looked toward the COO slowly. You told us the risks were manageable. The COO's jaw tightened, based on the information available at the time. Victor Hale closed the folder. No, he said quietly, based on the information you preferred. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, thunder rolled above the city while dark clouds swallowed the skyline entirely. Reflections of flashing server alerts danced across the conference room walls like warning beacons. At 1547, the lead investor requested a closed executive vote. Only board members remained inside. Assistants were dismissed, doors locked, and somewhere deep in the building, employees stopped pretending this was temporary turbulence. They could feel structural collapse approaching now, not technological, leadership. One floor below, an exhausted systems analyst reopened Elena's original infrastructure map on a secondary monitor. Thousands of interconnected pathways spread across the screen with terrifying elegance. Redundancies hidden beneath redundancies. Emergency routing logic nested like invisible lifeboats beneath stormwaters. For the first time, he understood something executives never had. The map wasn't complicated because Elena wanted control. It was complicated because reality was, and reality had finally stopped cooperating with executive ego. At 1812, phones across senior leadership began vibrating almost simultaneously. One message, confidential board notification. The CEO read it first, then sat down very slowly. Because after 12 years leading the company, he had just been informed the board would discuss his resignation before markets opened Monday morning. Friday morning arrived without sunlight. The city existed beneath a ceiling of low gray clouds that pressed against skyscrapers like a hand trying to force them downward. Traffic crawled through wet streets. News alerts glowed across phones inside cafes, elevators, airport lounges, and trading desks. Most people would forget the headlines by next week. Inside the company, nobody would. At 7:03, the first financial publication released an article about executive instability tied to failed client migration strategy. The wording was careful, corporate, almost polite. The market understood the danger anyway. By 7:11, the company's stock dropped 6% pre-market. Inside headquarters, television screens in reception areas suddenly became unbearable to look at. Employees walked faster today. Conversations ended when managers approached. Human resources scheduled alignment meetings nobody trusted. Entire departments refreshed internal chat channels obsessively while pretending to work normally. The illusion of control had finally cracked. And once that happened inside corporations, fear became impossible to contain. On the 42nd floor, the executive suite looked exhausted. Jackets hung over chairs, half-empty coffee cups covered polished tables like evidence after a long interrogation. Someone had removed decorative orchids from the hallway because no one remembered to water them. Small details always died first during crises. The CEO stood alone in his office watching rain slide down the windows in crooked silver lines. Below him, the city continued moving with indifferent rhythm. Taxis stopped, people crossed streets, delivery trucks unloaded boxes. The world never paused for corporate disasters. His phone buzzed again, another investor requesting clarification. Another board member avoiding direct support. Another legal recommendation written in cautious language that somehow sounded threatening anyway. Behind him, the television volume remained low, but one sentence still reached across the room clearly. Questions continue surrounding executive decisions connected to infrastructure oversight. Infrastructure oversight. Interesting phrase. A cleaner version of, you ignored the person who built the system. Someone knocked gently. The COO entered without waiting for permission. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them felt heavier now than any argument they'd had during the previous year. Once they had looked unstoppable together. Polished leadership magazine profiles, conference stages, interviews about innovation and disruption, corporate royalty wrapped in expensive tailoring and rehearsed certainty. Now they looked like survivors standing beside wreckage neither fully understood. "We need unified messaging before market open," the COO said. The CEO kept staring at the rain. "They're discussing my resignation." The COO hesitated only slightly. "It may calm investors." There it was. Not loyalty, containment. The CEO finally turned around slowly, and for the first time in years, genuine anger appeared beneath his controlled executive demeanor. "You assured me the migration risks were acceptable." "They were acceptable under projected—" "Stop." The word cut through the room sharply. Outside the office glass, assistants pretended not to listen while absolutely listening. The CEO walked toward the conference table, where printed copies of Elena's reports remained scattered like forensic evidence. Risk escalation memos, deferred infrastructure requests, emergency rollback recommendations, all documented, all ignored. One page contained a sentence highlighted by legal late the previous night. "Accelerated migration without regional dependency stabilization may trigger cascading service instability under peak transactional load." The timestamp beneath it was 8 months old. The CEO stared at it for a long moment. "She warned us repeatedly," he said quietly. The COO adjusted his tie. "She also resisted operational simplification." "No," the CEO replied. "She resisted fantasy." The room went still. Downstairs, another wave of panic spread through engineering after several enterprise clients requested emergency contract reviews. Conference rooms filled rapidly. Compliance officers appeared everywhere now, moving through departments with the cold efficiency of incoming winter. People noticed who suddenly avoided eye contact. People always noticed. At 10:18, an internal memo announced temporary suspension of executive bonuses. At 10:26, someone leaked the memo externally. By 10:41, financial media connected the bonus suspension to the client migration collapse. The stock dropped further. Phones began ringing nonstop across investor relations. One exhausted associate whispered near the elevators, "This place feels haunted." In a way, it was. Not by ghosts, by archived decisions. Across town, Elena sat inside a quiet meeting room, reviewing infrastructure proposals with her new team. Sunlight briefly pushed through clouds here, illuminating the edges of architectural diagrams spread across the table. One engineer frowned thoughtfully at a redundancy model she suggested. "That's excessive protection for a low-probability event." Elena leaned back calmly. Low probability becomes high probability the moment leadership mistakes confidence for competence. The room fell thoughtful after that. Her new colleagues respected silence differently. Nobody rushed to fill it with ego. Her phone vibrated again. Another former coworker. "The board hired external advisors." Then another. "People are saying the CEO is finished." Elena locked the screen without responding. No triumph touched her face, only a strange melancholy, because buildings did not collapse all at once, neither did companies. First came arrogance, then shortcuts disguised as efficiency, then the quiet removal of inconvenient experts. By the time consequences became visible publicly, the structural damage usually existed far beneath the surface already, and repairing trust always took longer than repairing systems. Back at headquarters, afternoon light faded early beneath thick storm clouds. The board assembled again behind sealed glass doors, while assistants carried updated financial projections inside with tense expressions. No one smiled anymore. Victor Hale arrived precisely at 1400. Same leather folder, same calmness, different outcome waiting beneath it. The CEO already knew. He could see it in the way board members avoided sustained eye contact, in the artificial gentleness of their voices, in the polite distance suddenly surrounding him like invisible quarantine tape. Corporate power disappeared gradually, right before it vanished completely. Victor sat down slowly. "We've completed preliminary review," he said. No dramatic pause, no theatrical speech, just business. The company failed to protect operational continuity. Investor confidence requires accountability. The word lingered heavily in the room. Accountability. Executives loved demanding it from employees, less from themselves. The CEO nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Somewhere beneath exhaustion and pride, he finally understood the brutal simplicity of the situation. The infrastructure failure was survivable. The loss of trust was not. Outside the windows, rain swept across the skyline in silver sheets, while the city lights flickered awake one by one beneath the storm. Beautiful from a distance, fragile up close. Victor slid a document quietly across the table. Resignation terms. Nobody looked surprised anymore. And far below the executive floor, employees throughout the company were already whispering the same sentence, like an unavoidable truth finally spoken aloud. They fired the foundation of the system. Monday opened with sunlight so bright it almost felt cruel. After days of storms, the sky above the city stretched clear and polished, reflecting gold across glass towers as commuters flooded sidewalks carrying coffee cups and unfinished anxiety. Financial news screens blinked silently inside lobby elevators. Traders refreshed pre-market numbers before crossing streets. Somewhere, a street violinist played beside the subway entrance, as if corporations had never collapsed before. But inside headquarters, the atmosphere remained heavy enough to bend sound itself. At 800 sharp, the internal announcement arrived. The CEO had resigned, no dramatic farewell video, no triumphant speech about new beginnings. Just a carefully edited memo from the board thanking him for years of dedicated leadership during transformational growth. Employees read it in silence across dozens of floors. Some stared, some pretended not to care, some quietly forwarded the message to recruiters. The COO's office remained closed all morning. That detail spread through the building faster than the resignation itself. Near the operations center, engineers exchanged exhausted looks while monitoring systems finally stabilized after emergency rollback procedures restored portions of the original architecture. Elena's fallback logic, the same complexity executives once mocked, had quietly prevented total collapse during the weekend. The irony no longer felt subtle. At 09:17, another executive meeting began behind sealed glass walls, though the room looked very different now. Chairs sat farther apart, voices stayed lower, nobody interrupted each other anymore. Crisis had stripped away performance, leaving only fatigue and consequences behind. Victor Hale stood near the window, reviewing updated recovery forecasts. "Can operations survive?" one board member asked. "Yes," replied the interim director carefully. "Eventually." "And reputation?" No one answered immediately, because everyone in the room understood something investors rarely forgave. Technical failures looked expensive. Arrogance looked dangerous. Outside the executive floor, entire departments moved cautiously through the workday like passengers after severe turbulence. Employees who once worshipped aggressive leadership now spoke differently. Less admiration for charisma, more respect for competence. One junior engineer quietly told another near the coffee station, "I think half this company confused confidence with intelligence." The other answered softly, "Not anymore." By noon, external consultants filled conference rooms carrying laptops, legal pads, and expressions of expensive concern. Audits had begun officially now. Every approval chain, every migration decision, every ignored escalation. Paper trails became graveyards surprisingly fast. Meanwhile, 50 blocks away, Elena stepped onto the rooftop terrace of her new office building during lunch break. The air smelled clean after rain. Far below, traffic moved through sunlight in long, glittering lines, while helicopters drifted between towers like slow, mechanical birds. Her new company's rooftop garden remained quiet, except for distant keyboard clicks, leaking faintly through open terrace doors. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe fully, not victory, relief. A colleague joined her carrying 2 coffees. "You've been trending on tech forums all morning," he said lightly. Elena frowned. "That sounds unpleasant." He handed her a cup. "People are calling you the engineer who predicted the collapse." She stared across the skyline silently. Prediction wasn't the right word. She had simply listened to reality longer than leadership had. Below them, sunlight flashed across the windows of her former company's tower, beautiful from a distance, still standing, still functioning. Yet everyone inside now understood the hidden cost of removing people who carried institutional knowledge quietly without demanding applause for it. Some employees would leave soon. Some executives already had recruiters calling privately. Some careers would never fully recover from the investigation now unfolding. But the company itself, it would survive. Smaller, perhaps. Humbled, certainly. Forced at last to respect the invisible architecture beneath ambition. And strangely, that mattered more to Elena than revenge ever could have. Because systems failed when ego became louder than expertise. The lesson was painfully simple. Late that afternoon, legal finalized internal review summaries. The findings remained confidential, but rumors escaped immediately anyway. Deferred infrastructure safeguards, suppressed escalation urgency, strategic acceleration overriding operational readiness. None of it looked criminal, which somehow made it worse. Just ordinary arrogance. The kind corporations normalized every day until reality submitted its invoice. At 1642, someone inside headquarters reopened Elena's original infrastructure map during a recovery planning session. This time, nobody called it over-engineered. Nobody complained about complexity. Engineers studied it carefully now, almost respectfully, tracing pathways and redundancies with the focus of archaeologists, uncovering the foundation beneath a ruined city. One senior consultant finally murmured the sentence everyone had spent the week slowly realizing. "She didn't build complexity." He looked around the silent room. "She built survival." No one argued. As evening settled across the skyline, office lights flickered alive floor by floor. Cleaning crews moved quietly through hallways, still carrying traces of panic from previous days. Somewhere inside the tower, someone removed the CEO's nameplate from the executive corridor wall. A tiny sound, metal lifting from polished wood. Endings rarely sounded dramatic in real life. Across the city, Elena packed her laptop calmly at the end of her new workday. Her phone buzzed once more with messages from former coworkers still trapped inside the fallout, but she ignored them for now. Instead, she paused briefly beside the enormous windows overlooking the glowing city below. Cars moved like rivers of light. Storm clouds were finally gone. And somewhere behind her, new engineers were already discussing future infrastructure plans with the careful seriousness that real systems deserved. No applause followed her exit from the old company, no public revenge, no speeches, just consequences unfolding exactly where warnings had once been ignored, quietly, legally, inevitably.